Welcome to Recombination Nation. Today I'm talking to Zach Alfers. He is an ethnobotanist from Pennsylvania who works extensively with tree and perennial crops that are found throughout the temperate zone. He also is involved with the Northern Nut Growers Association, the North American Fruit Explorers, and he helped found the Keystone Crops Cooperative, and Nomad Seed, and a whole bunch of other organizations. He has got his finger in so many different pies. And I think I found someone who is closest to what I could describe as being a mentor. So I'm hoping to extract some useful information, particularly when it comes to building organizations, because I'm trying to do the same on my side of the world. So that's my very rushed attempt at trying to sum up all of the things that you're working on, Zach. Can you give us a bit of a perspective, like a bit of a self-introduction? Like, what's your origin story? How did you turn into such a fanatical plant lover?
Yeah, hi Shane. It's great to be here. Great to talk with you. So the story of how I got into plants, I guess I want to try to keep it brief if I can, but it's hard not to go back to the beginning. I think when I was a kid, I was always interested in nature. I always loved nature, even when I didn't really understand it or have. And I didn't grow up in a farming family or anything like that. We kind of lived on the edge of suburbia. So my experience with nature was what it was. As I got older, um, well, actually, when I was really young, I was into computers and stuff, and so I just turned 37, so I'm a millennial that remembers the life before the internet,
Hmm.
right? And so when Windows 98 came out in or 95 came out, um, I got really interested in that. But then coming into my mid to late teens, I kind of wanted to put the brakes on that. I wanted to get back out into the world of nature and working with my hands and tangible things. And so at that point, I started to look for opportunities on local organic farms. And so I had some volunteer experience with a local farm, and then a friend of mine and I drove out to Colorado, and we were in a 6-week wolfing experience on the western slope out there in Paonia, Colorado. And then coming back, so this would have been back in 2012. I was just really engaged and inspired by that kind of lifestyle and working closely with plants. And I I had heard of this word permaculture, and a friend of mine from college, Bob, he said, "Oh, you got to meet this guy Dale, who he's got a permaculture homestead. He's got a lot of pawpaw trees. He's got a native plant nursery and all that." And so I met him in the beginning of 2013, and he became a good friend and mentor to me. And I learned all kinds of native plant propagation and, all the permaculture ideas and philosophies. And it just, there was no going back. I was hooked, and I just, not only did I love it, but I think I have a knack for it. And so it just felt very natural for me. And so I never looked back. I ultimately didn't complete college, and I spent a few years traveling in my 20s, and I got to experience some ecosystems on the West Coast and in the Great Basin and down in the Deep South and Southern Appalachia and up in the Northeast and places like Vermont. And so I got to see a lot of the lower 48 of the United States, and all the while I was just really trying to learn as much as I could about the native plants and the native plant community. And I have had a big interest in foraging and agriculture, and that became an interest in tree crops based agriculture. And so yeah, I just studied while I was in the field, camping and living. And I always knew that I wanted to come home to Pennsylvania, and I've had a deep connection with the Susquehanna River, the lower Susquehanna River region, since I first came here when I was like 16 or so on a camping trip with some friends. And so I'm I'm fortunate to live here now by the river, and I've got a little ho homestead and a plant nursery that I run, and I get to do all this stuff for for a living, at least partially. So I'm super grateful for all that.
I have to ask this question because you have a that experience, that formative experience, looking all over the US at both the local ecology and the let's use the umbrella term regenerative farming cultures that were emerging. What's your take on like the state of all of those different regions in the US? I know that's a huge question, but like how how different are they in their how far along they are with developing like sustainable local agriculture?
Oh, that's a big question, and I don't know that I can really honestly answer that in a good way for all these different places that I only have tenuous connections with at best.
Hmm.
I would say that, that there's so many differences. In the Pacific Northwest, you get a lot of rainfall, but you also have a wet season and a dry season, and they can be pretty affected by drought out there. Um, I know California, Colorado, and a lot of parts of the Great Basin have had pretty historic drought that I don't think has really officially come to an end. It just seems to get worse with climate change, or at least more extreme or more erratic, more unpredictable. Um, we're dealing with the same thing out here in the East Coast. We get high rainfalls, but it just seems to be more and more erratic and less predictable, and we have more prolonged periods where there's no rainfall at all, sometimes for 3 or 4 weeks. And then the skies open and we just never quite get enough. And that seems to be the name of the game for the past several years now. So am I answering your question, or are you
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
asking
yeah.
about
Well,
climate or
what
yeah.
was there a particular reason why the Northeast appealed to you as the place to put down roots?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, biogeographically, we're actually the northernmost point of the southeast, if you think in terms of
Ah, okay, yep,
ecosystems and
yep.
communities. So where I am on the lower Susquehanna River, I'm situated right above the Chesapeake Bay, which is kind of like the big water hub of the Mid-Atlantic region. So I kind of consider myself native to the Mid-Atlantic. It's the region that I call home. There's the Piedmont ecoregion here, which is the foothills to the Appalachian Mountains. And then, of course, you can go a little bit further east and you can get to the coast, where, in New Jersey, you've got the Pine Barrens and you've got this coastal maritime forest that has historically stretched from basically the Long Island area of New York down to the Outer Banks of North Carolina.
Hmm.
Um, so there's all kinds of different communities, and it's really hard for me to separate myself from place. And so a lot of my thinking is very place based and place oriented. I think very bioregionally, and so the concerns of a farmer in the South are going to be different from the concerns of a farmer in the Northwest or in the Midwest. And a lot of this is pretty pretty understandable, pretty obvious. But when you break it down to the details, it can create some pretty significant differences. Even here in the East Coast, like whether you like your choice of crops, your choice of perennials, your choice of even in an industrial conventional farming sense. Where I live is part of the largest non-irrigated farmland in the United States. And so if you go a little bit further west into Ohio, for example, you start to see like the boom sprayers over the farm fields and things like that. And you go further down south, you'll see that. Um, but we here in the mid-Atlantic are mostly just relying on rainfall
Hmm.
and the native soil types. So yeah, there's just so much there. It's a big question.
it gives you a promise of like structural sustainability that you can afford to pull out industrial inputs and still have a productive system.
Absolutely. And I will say that where I am in Pennsylvania is really it's really a very good Goldilocks zone, even thinking globally. It's kind of a privileged place to live, to be honest, because we have some of the most flowing surface water in the lower 48. I think Pennsylvania and Kentucky have this rivalry over who has more surface water flowing through their creeks and streams. Um, we have moderate climate. We generally have good soils, depending on where you're located, especially in the valley regions, and kind of the southeastern quarter of Pennsylvania is known for having very good soils. And we get a good amount of rainfall, and we have winter, which is a really important natural cycle for breaking like pests and diseases and things like that. When things go dormant, it really knocks down a lot of the pathogens and insect pests and pressures that can build up. So we're in a pretty nice zone here, and it's not as easy in other places.
Yeah, tell me about it. Tell me about it. I'm very jealous. It's very uh picture storybook kind of fantasy of what doing agriculture under those conditions must be like. Now, we should probably talk about some specific crops that you're working on. So it's a very, very long list. I'm going to try and pick a few that I think we can go into a bit more detail in. Um, Maybe in the future I'll get you back to talk about more of them because you've got so many on the go. But how about we start talking about your experience with fertile sweet potatoes? Did you get a start with that material through Mark Reed?
No, actually, I've never exchanged material with Mark Reed. I'd love to if I'll have to try to make contact with him sometime. But
Do it, do
I got my
it.
yeah. So I got my start with that. It was after I was introduced to the work of Joseph Lofthouse, and I really got started thinking about the uh, the advantages of breeding high diversity into your crops, and that's like the land race concept, which is kind of this aspirational concept where you get all these different heirlooms and different genotypes and genetics together, even if they're from far flung places, and you let them cross-pollinate and make seed in the place where you're at. And over time, that will create these landrace crops. And so I've always loved sweet potatoes. They're just a real rock star crop. I mean, you can keep them for over a year in good conditions, and they're really easy to save as roots, as tubers. They're delicious. They're very nutritious. Like they're a true staple root. You just get so much nutrition from them, and they're quite flavorful. Um, so when I was introduced to Joseph Lofthouse's ideas and I started thinking about sweet potatoes, and then around that time, I was on like the open source plant breeding forum, and I know Mark Reed was there at the time, and he was talking about his success breeding sweet potato as like a self-sowing annual, and I believe
hmm
he's in southern Indiana, if I'm not mistaken. So he's
Yes.
he's in a very yeah he's in a very similar climate as I am, and I have this friend, Jana Fishman, and been to me, and her husband is Doug Elliott, who's a really renowned folk storyteller and herbalist in Southern Appalachia. And so they live in Western North Carolina, and Jana is just like this fanatical gardener. She's amazing. She works with like the Arc of Taste, and she does some work with Southern Exposure Seed. And her big thing is growing tropical perennials as temperate annuals. So she
Mm.
got me interested in um, growing the Korean Edo, like the taro, the
hmm
Colocasia esculenta. And she maintains a garden with like uh, at least 100 accessions of sweet potato, if not more. And she keeps notes on all these different varieties, and she's got them labeled by color, by productivity, and she's just really felt this responsibility to maintain all these varieties. So, when I learned about the possibilities with sweet potato, and I knew that as an outcrossing species, like you'll never get seed if you just grow a single clone. You have to have more genetic individuals, and the more you can get together, the better.
Mm.
And so I thought to myself, if ever there was a place where I would find fertile sweet potato seeds, it's there. And so I went down for a visit, maybe back in 2017 or 2016, with Doug and Yana, and we went through Yana's garden. This would have been in probably September. So the sweet potatoes weren't dug yet. And after walking through the garden, we were able to find a handful of capsules that were ripe. And from that, I got 12 seeds. Of those 12 seeds, I was able to get four to germinate the following year. And then I got another 12 seeds off of those four plants. And then, I was able to get about another four or five to germinate. So it's very slow growing. And then what really accented my sweet potato breeding was when Michael Jennings sent me some seeds from his breeding in California. And I think Mike Jennings might have gotten started from Mark Reed's um, genetics.
It's amazing how one person's
And
work, if they're willing to
sweet's the
send it
stuff
out
I had
into the
gotten
world,
from
it gets around,
Jan.
it loops. Oh, sorry.
Totally.
Mm.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of power in a seed. Um, so Mike Jennings' population tended towards purple, and the ones I had gotten from Yana were tending towards yellow and white, which is my personal culinary preference. But I wanted to see all the colors represented, kind of like what Joseph Lofthouse did with Astronomy Domini, the sweet corn. That's what I wanted with the sweet potato. I wanted to come up with a landrace population where when you planted out the seeds, you would get all the different color expressions from white to yellow to orange to purple. And I even was surprised to find some nice modeling colors. Like sometimes you'd have like white and purple marbling together in the same tuber.
Hmm.
And of course, all kinds of different varieties in skin color and things like that, and density. That's a big one. Some are much more soft and supple, and others are more dense and they need to be cooked longer. So that was kind of the beginnings of my sweet potato work. But I should also mention that my friend Alex Wenger, he runs the Fields Edge Research Farm in Lidditz, Pennsylvania. So he's a friend and geographic neighbor to myself. He had grown sweet potatoes from seed before too. And I don't know where he got his seed from originally, but he had a couple varieties that he said were like pretty reliably flowering for him. And one he gave me was called Mexican Purple, which the story of that one I'm unclear of. He said that it came from some Mexican guys and nobody knew what it actually was, so they just called it Mexican Purple. I think I still have that in my collection, but to be honest, I've kind of lost track of some of the older cultivars that I have. They've kind of gradually gotten mixed in, and at
Mm.
this point, most of what I have that's saved is seed grown plants from previous years. But the Mexican purple got integrated into the population, and with that combined with Michael Jennings seeds, and then the stuff I had gotten from Yana, I kind of gradually got to get more color expressions expressing. And so at this point, if I focus on growing sweet potatoes from seed in a given year, I can generally get a few hundred seeds, which is not quite my goal. I was hoping 1,000 seeds so I could really just like not only distribute them, but yeah, mostly for distribution. I'd love to get the seeds in the hands of others. And yeah, side note, if you want some sweet potato seeds, send me an email. Um, but yeah, there's a lot of interesting things have come through that project. One curious thing is that if you want sweet potato seeds, the most reliable way to do that is to grow seedlings because they tend to flower much more profusely when they're seedlings, and that means you get more seeds. So when you save them as keeper varieties for the following year, they tend to flower a lot less. And so one thing that I'm working on this year is I have a garden of all my keeper variety. Actually, not growing sweet potatoes from seed this year, unless any volunteer in the garden, which I think there's a few seedlings poking up. But I'm hoping to identify keeper varieties that will reliably continue to flower and set seed. And I've heard that if you trellis them, they are more likely to flower. So I'm going to be experimenting this year with various ways to try to get seed production to continue.
Very interesting. I should put you on to a friend of mine who's hybridized sweet potato with Pangerata, the man root, which
Oh, is that Chance on Substrat
that's
on
him.
Substack?
I'll be interviewing him soon for this batch of
Yeah, that's some
episodes.
incredible work. You
Yeah.
know, it's amazing to hear his success because I grow manroot. It grows here on the islands on the river, the Ipomoea pandurata, and I have like a big plant of it in my yard, and it's not too far from the sweet potatoes, but I've never honestly bothered to grow out the seeds from that pandurata on the idea that they could have hybridized with the sweet potato. I just kind of thought that it was a case for controlled pollination, which I
Yeah.
haven't done yet.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean,
But he got a chance cross, I believe, right?
well, he set things up and then grew out all of the seeds. So
Uh-huh.
he kind of he didn't do. I don't think he did hand pollination. Well, you know, I'll have to interview him soon and find out the details. But yeah, it's a genus I think with a lot of untapped potential.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I guess I could express one of my other goals with the sweet potato project was to try to find like shorter and shorter season sweet potatoes that
Mm,
germinate in colder soils because generally they don't want to germinate until soil gets around 70 degrees, which in our climate is around June, like the end of May. And
mm,
at that point, you know, you really need a few weeks as a in when it's in the cotyledon stage before it kind of gets its true leaves and you know can start to get the energy it needs to tuberize. So um yeah, I Mark Reed's idea is having like a self-sowing like population of sweet potatoes, and I think that's a great goal. But I'm also interested in finding things that are going to do better in northern climates
mm.
and all that
I guess it's also an example of the genus, the breeding of the genus is starting to reach critical mass in your part of the world. Like there's enough people doing it in their own way and interacting with each other that it's more than the sum of its parts as a total effort.
for sure.
I'm very jealous of the number of people that you have up in the US to collaborate with compared to little old Australia. Now, another species I've been fascinated with for a very long time, mostly because it's so beautiful, is the Camassia, the camas lilies. And I
Oh
wonder
yeah.
if you're doing, well, for people who don't know about them, can you give an overview of like what they are and how they've been used in the past and what you're doing with them?
Yeah, so the Camassia in North America, I think there's 6 or 7 species. There's the Western camises, which are mostly in the Pacific Northwest. You've got like the greater camas, Camassia leglinii, which tends to have like deep blue, almost purple flowers, and it's quite big. It can be like 3 feet tall.
Mm,
And then you've got the regular camas, which is Camassia quamash, and that can have like periwinkle blue flowers all the way down to like sky blue. There's a lot of range there. It's actually very similar to our Atlantic camas, the eastern camas, which is Camassia psiloides. There's another eastern camas, Camassia angusta, which is in like the southern prairies. I think it's in like the Black Belt prairies of like Texas, Louisiana, maybe into Alabama. And then there's Cusix camas, Camassia cusicii, which I think is not really an edible camas. It's more like a soaproot kind of plant.
hmm
Um, and I feel like I'm missing one or two. There's probably a couple more.
But
Um,
to my mind, that's like the perfect starting material for a novel domestication. Like I
Absolutely.
struggle to think of a better crop that's like just perfectly set up there. They're these beautiful, fleshy blue flowered lilies that have a long history of being used for their edible starchy roots, and they're all interfertile with each other as far as I can tell. Like hybridization isn't difficult. So are you going to be the person to like transform it into the next generation of a useful perennial staple crop?
Maybe we'll see. I grow a lot of the Camassia psaloides, but I also have the Quamash and the Lake Linnei.
Hmm.
And I'll see if they hybridize. I've got so many projects going. It's hard to focus on the Camassia in particular, but I'll tell you kind of my story with
Hmm.
that crop. So just to give more background on this crop, in the Pacific Northwest, it's been a very important Native American staple food to the point where like regions in Idaho and eastern Washington, like the Palouse Prairie region of Idaho. I think there's even a town called like Camas, uh, Camas Prairie or something. I think it's in Idaho. Um, you could go there before colonization, and you would look out on the valleys, and it would be a sea of blue when the
Mm.
camas is in bloom. And those were cultivated fields. I mean, if you want to think about it that way, the native peoples of that region would dig those roots with a digging stick right around the time that the flowers started to die away and the seeds were ripening. And then by digging the roots and leaving the seeds behind in the same holes that they're leaving, it basically tilled soil. Um, they were promoting the Camassia to just like great extent to the point where it would be like there'd be these extensive camas prairies. So the bulb of the camas, I mean, it's a bulb. It's rather like an onion. It has layers, and it's very rich in inulin, which is the same compound that's in Jerusalem artichoke. Inulin is not it's like a prebiotic sugar, so some people's systems it will cause like a lot of flatulence, and it can be like kind of this hard fiber to digest. But what the folks in the Pacific Northwest were doing is they were slow cooking this camas. So they would often have them in like these earth bake ovens. They would dig like trenches or pits and put a lot of wood ash down in there as kind of a bed, and then they would situate layers of vegetation and roots and vegetation and hot coals, and then cover those earth ovens up. And you come back about 36 hours later. It's basically like nature's version of the crock pot. And so that slow cooking of the camas, it converts the inulin into fructose, at which point the bulb, which is rather like an onion when it's raw, it's like a white, fleshy kind of thing, it turns chocolate brown, and that inulin having been converted to fructose, it's extremely sweet. It's very, very delicious. And then from that point, the bulbs could be dehydrated and basically used as a long-term storage food for the native peoples of the Pacific Northwest, like the Nez Perce and the Shoshone and up and down the Pacific Northwest. I think even into maybe British Columbia there on the coast there. Camas has been very important.
Who needs high
So
fructose
it's
corn
really
syrup? Who needs high
I
fructose
know.
corn syrup when you've got that? That sounds delicious.
So it's just a really incredible crop, and I mean it's so beautiful. I believe it's in the Asparagiaceae family, which is like in the liliales. So it's like the greater order of lilies. And so other parts of the plant beside the bulb are edible. You can cut the stalks in the spring when they come up, just like asparagus, um, which I generally don't do because I'm interested in having flowers and seed production. But I have eaten it before, and it's quite good. Um, Let's see. Also on those Camas prairies, what's interesting is where the elevation is a little higher. Like you have these little mounds and hummocks that are naturally in the prairie. Often you would have another root food that would grow on that was more like higher, like to be situated higher and drier. So you look out at the Camas prairies and you see the sea of blue, and then on the little mound of the hummock you would see the white flowers of the yampa, which is another really important food of the the whole western region, basically west of the Continental Divide, west of the Rockies. But there is a species of eastern yampa that comes as far as Ohio, and so I grow that one too.
Hmm.
But going back to camas, in my botanical work and studying ethnobotany and connections between native peoples and native plants, I learned that there's these disjuncts of eastern camas, the Camassia psalloides, that come as far as the eastern North Carolina, on a place that's called Occoneechee Bend, which was a large settlement for the Occoneechee Nation. Um, and surprise, surprise, there's all this camas right where the settlement was.
Mm.
And the Occoneechee now, there's a lot of pre-colonial pre-colonial native lifeways and cultural groups can be very difficult for us to understand today, especially as a non-native person myself. So, some people say that the Occoneechee came from like more of the Midwest, that they came from the Ohio River Valley region where camas is much more in abundance there. And so if
Ah,
if
they
if
took the
that
plants
idea is
with them.
correct,
Yes.
that's
Yeah.
right. Yeah, they took the plants with them. But then there's also some other ideas that maybe the Okinichi didn't come from that place. So, I don't want to make any statements about that. But I think that these connections are really fascinating. There's also a lot of Camassia in western Pennsylvania, and that's kind of that extension of the Ohio River Valley. It's on the decline in western Pennsylvania, is my understanding. I've also come across some records that suggest it was in the mid-Atlantic Piedmont, like around Baltimore. But I don't know that those any of those populations are still existing.
Mm,
So it's sort of a question there. I've even found uh, some old botanical references from the 1800s that suggest it might have been in the Finger Lakes area of New York.
mhm.
And I've written about some of this on my Nomad Seed blog, where I go into in depth about the camas in particular.
Do you know
But
if is
they,
anybody
yeah.
doing deliberate crossing of like wide crossing of Camassia that you know of?
I've done some of it. So when I first started to take camas into cultivation, I went on a trip throughout the South and I visited some populations in Illinois, in Alabama, in Tennessee, in Georgia, and I had a couple others in there too. And
Mm,
then I had some cultivated Camassia psaloides material, and I collected seed from those different populations in those different regions, and I've grown it all together. And so it's like sort of it's not really a wide cross because it's all within a single species, but I'm trying to get that connectivity
mm,
back into the
mm.
species and kind of build some of that diversity back. So that's what I've got going. Kentucky was the other place where I have some accessions.
Mm.
And um
Even within the
yeah,
same
that
species, mixing different populations like that can unleash the potential for transformation. It kind of increases the adaptability of the next generation.
totally. Yeah, I've noticed that my Kentucky stuff tends to be bigger. They're bigger, taller, stronger plants. So I don't know what that, what that is. I mean, they're growing on the same soils, but they are in different location. Like the Kentucky stuff has a little bit more sunlight. The other stuff is a little bit more shaded. It works really well as a spring ephemeral, so it's a good niche. It's a good complement for like tree crops based uh, agroforestry,
Yeah.
because the Camassia will come up in the spring, the foliage will come out, and then by the time the shoots have come up and the flowers have opened and the seed is starting to ripen, that's about when the canopy fills in. And
Hmm.
so they fit perfectly into that niche. And so a lot of times when you find them persisting in the eastern US, they are under a woodland canopy.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll highlight here for anybody listening. If you're looking for a project and you've only got a small garden or a greenhouse and you're in the right climate, Camassia is one of those opportunities for people to bring all of the species together, do deliberate hand crosses to like get that. Because often plants don't necessarily want to, it isn't their first choice of pollen to get pollinated by something that's quite different. But with a little bit of human attention, you can get through that awkward first step and you could be creating something that's very useful to the broader kind of agroforestry community. I think there's a huge opportunity there.
I think Luther Burbank was making Camassia hybrid. It'd be cool if that material still existed. I remember reading about that. He was
Interesting.
crossing the various Western camuses. I'm not sure if he incorporated pseudoides in there. Um, yeah, it's an interesting question. Like, what would you get if you crossed a Western camus with an Eastern camus? As I mentioned before, the Camassia quamash and the Camassia psaloides are extremely similar species, at least visually, like phenotypically.
Mm.
So I imagine, while they're separated geographically, I don't know how much novelty you would get by crossing those particular two. But like to incorporate like linii in the mix and maybe some of the other species, you'd get just more and more phenotypic plasticity, which is really what you want. And a lot of this stuff is just like a surprise, and that's the joy of it. Like when you make these crosses, you don't necessarily know what traits you're going to get.
Hmm.
In my case, I'm just trying to fortify the populations and just have like a robust genome that hopefully someone else would want to work with from there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Now, another genus that I guess I would say you're a specialist in is carrier. So in Australia, we know that as pecans, but there's a much bigger range of species and uses among the hickories and the yellowbuds, I think, as well. Can you give us a bit of an overview about your work with that really exciting tree oil and protein crop?
Yeah, totally. Hickories are like that's deep love for me for the hickories. So as you mentioned, a pecan is a kind of hickory. It's in the Carya genus, so the pecan is Carya illinoisensis. But then you also have the shagbark hickory and the shellbark hickory, which just can make fantastic nuts for culinary purposes, for cracked kernel, for extracting the kernel, just like you would with the pecan. There's also the bitter nut, or the new rebrand is yellowbud hickory, for the cordiformis, and that one, it's called bitter nut because it's really high in tannic acid, so it's horribly bitter if you eat the kernels raw. But tannic acid and oil, or I'm sorry, tannic acid is water soluble,
Mm.
and water and oil don't mix. And so Sam Thayer, who's a very well-known foraging author up in Wisconsin, about 20 years ago, he uh, he had some familiarity with the food industry and oil pressing and all that, and encountering the yellowbud hickory, he thought, wow, if only you could extract the oil from that, you wouldn't have to worry about the bitterness. And so sure enough, that put him on a path to innovate that process. And he figured out how to press the yellow bud for a very high quality cooking oil using a German Kernkraft oil press. And you mentioned the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative in your introduction, so we could talk about that later. But
Mm.
one of our flagship products is hickory oil from the yellow bud. And there's several other species of hickory. A lot of them would be considered like minor crops at best. Like there's the mockernut hickory, which the lore states it's called mockernut because the nut meat is so good, it's so sweet, but it's so hard to get out of there. So it's the nut that mocks you. And that was actually my introduction to the hickories. I just, when I was living in Virginia, they were all through the woods, and I would just gather up the mocker nuts and I would crack them with the back of a hatchet on a log, one after the other, and try to extract the meats. And I just fell in love with the genus right then and there. Um, and then there's several other species like the nutmeg hickory, which has a very small disjunct population, mostly in Alabama and Louisiana, but there is some in North Carolina. It's like glacial refugia stuff, and that's sort of a basal. That's a basal hickory that's um well, I have to back up a little bit. There's two main sections of hickory. There's like the pecan hickories, which is like the pecans, the water hickory, the bitternut hickory, um, and I think there's one more in there. And then there's the true hickories, which are the shagbark, the shellbark, the mockernut, the pignut, the red hickory. Um, and so the nutmeg hickory is more basal to the two sections, so it's like neither a true hickory nor a pecan hickory, or a water hickory.
It's amazing how often you see that structure in the phylogeny of a genus that there's like one or two really odd basal species and then two broad divisions among the remaining species. There's this kind of fractal pattern in evolution that appears over and over.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a bunch of species in East Asia too. I don't, depending on which botanist you talk to, there's anywhere from like five to some say like over 10 species in Asia.
Mm,
And historically there were hickories in Europe too, but they seem to have died out about 2 million years ago. They basically didn't come back after the Holocene era
mm.
began.
So, how much work has been done with like wide
But
hybridization
they're
in
just
carrier?
incredible incredible trees.
Mm.
Well, carriers like oaks, they'll naturally hybridize quite readily. So there's tons of natural hybrids out there of like pecan and shellbark or pecan and shagbark and shellbark. The shagbark and the bitternut hybridize all the time. So those are the main ones that frequently hybridize. And there's work going back over 100 years that's been mostly under the banner of the Northern Nut Growers Association, where folks have made selections from the wild, which they generally propagate via grafting. And so I've compiled a list of hickory cultivars, and there's over 400 of them, and I think some 60 of those are like hicans. It's like the hickory pecan hybrid. So you've got the pecan by shellbark or the pecan by shagbark. A good number of those are shagbark by bitternut. A good number of those are shagbark by shellbark. So they naturally hybridize quite a bit.
Mm.
And I have one tree that I believe has four species in it. It's like a shagbark by bitternut crossed with a pecan by shellbark. And it's just like this wild thing. It's a big nut with really thin husks, really thin shell. There's almost no convolutions inside the shell, so when you crack it, they just fall out like a pecan. But the bark is shaggy and it's got five leaflets, just like a shagbark. Um, so yeah, I have all these different accessions of hickory, and it's my dream to breed them as a crop. But it's a very long-term process. There's a 96-year-old nut grower here in Pennsylvania, Bob Sipe, who's been at it since he was like in his 40s, and his trees are mature and bearing, but they're not they haven't even hit their stride yet. They're not even 100 years old yet. So, it's how to breed them is really quite a puzzle. Some friends of mine are now like trying to collect pollen and store it in like -80 degrees, freezers. I think like maybe with like liquid nitrogen or something.
Mhm.
Um, and then keep that for following seasons so they can make controlled crosses of various hickories.
That I respect the ambition behind that. I know how much is involved with those laboratory level techniques. I mean, uh, one of your past interviews that I listened to, you talked about various like original like pre-colonial populations of hickories and all these various species showing influence of the native people moving them around and selecting them. And I wonder if we're kind of picking up that thread today of resuming the tradition that was almost lost.
Totally, yeah. In my opinion, the hickory was basically a domesticated species in the eastern United States. Now, if you want to split hairs and push back against that claim, I would acknowledge that okay, maybe it's semi-domesticated, but either way, the influence of human relationship there is very clear. In the archaeological record, the number one charred food remains that are found are hickory shells.
Mm.
And now that can be pecans in the south, or it can be shagbark. There's like a cave in Kentucky where they've just found like tons of shagbark and shellbark charred charred remains, like where New York City is now, like where Battery Park is. There's been some digs that have found just like huge caches of shagbark hickory shells. So it was the single most important tree staple of Eastern North America. And people often focus on chestnut or oak, and while I'm sure those have always been used as important foods. If you're going by archaeological remains, it's the hickory hands down. Um, and that makes sense because the hickory is kind of a high oil, high protein kind of staple, whereas the acorns and the chestnuts are mostly starch. They also require a little bit more processing. The chestnut not so much, but the acorns need to be leached or nixtamalized or something like that.
Mm.
Whereas the hickory, you can just crack it open and you can eat it. And so one of our best accounts comes from William Bartram, who was traveling through what's now Georgia, and he was among the Creek, the Creek Nation, um, and he described extensive ancient cultivated fields full of tree crops, in particular the jug what at the time had the nomenclature Juglans exaltata, which he called the shell-barked hickory. Now it's unclear if he means shagbark or shellbark or both. It's kind of an arcane point, but he also talked about mulberry, persimmon, honey locust, um, beautyberry, um, and all kinds of things in the understory. And he was very clear in his account that these were cultivated orchards. He said that some families had like vast stores of hickory nuts that they would keep throughout the winter, like bushels and bushels of hickory nuts. So it's been a very important food for a long time. Recently, there's a colleague of mine who's doing some genotyping on in Caria, and his work is not published yet, so I'll wait until it's published before sharing like the paper or his name or anything. But he found that there's traces of pecan introgression in shellbarks all the way up in Ontario, Canada,
Hmm.
and out in the Finger Lakes of New York. There's traces of pecan introgression in central Pennsylvania, um, in the Hudson River Valley of New York, and for that trace to be there, there's pretty much only one way it could have happened, and that's through human trade. Because if
Interesting.
you look at the biogeography of these different species, pecan natively only comes as far north as the Ohio River Valley. Around Cincinnati, Ohio, I believe, is where some of the like the northeast extension of the pecan is. And for that northeast extension to end up with a trace signal in central Pennsylvania, it means that those seeds had to cross hundreds of miles of ridge and valley um, mountains, and that the Allegheny Plateau, which has is known for being like a generally a higher elevation, shale-based, um, cold cold environment. It's absolutely not pecan habitat by any stretch of the imagination.
Mm.
And so the fact that that pecan trace is in shagbark hickories in central Pennsylvania kind of begs the question, how did it get there?
Yeah, yeah.
And, conceivably like maybe a bird or an animal distributed it that far, but it's very unlikely, especially when you consider that like the Holocene era, which began with the melting of the glaciers with the end of the Ice Age about 12,000 years ago,
Mm.
hickory wasn't even anywhere near that region. The hickory was in its glacial refugia down in Mexico and parts of the southeast coastal plain and maybe some areas adjacent to southern Appalachia. And all of the area of Pennsylvania, I mean, half of Pennsylvania was under a glacier, right? And then the rest of it was tundra, taiga at best, if there was any forest at all. And it took a few thousand years for the eastern temperate forest just to start marching northward. So the fact that, you have this trace of pecan in central Pennsylvania only like, you know, 10,000 years later is pretty astronomically improbable if you don't consider humans.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love it. I have a couple of related questions from that. Um, so the development of human managed forest-based agriculture, I think you could agree is necessarily a slower process, particularly for very long-lived species like pecans and hickories. And I wonder, has anyone considered if the spread of maize-based agriculture into North America, which happened relatively recently among
Yeah.
the indigenous peoples, did that interfere with the tree-based agriculture? Did it basically shift people's priorities away from managing the forests and they spent more time in their corn patches?
No, I don't think so because from the archaeological record and the cultural record, the kind of agriculture that was practiced in Eastern North America and then going down into the Mesoamerican tropics was a slash and burn, shifting, like swiddening kind of agriculture.
Mm,
So if you go down to like the Yucatec and Lacandon Maya in Mexico and Guatemala, they still practice the traditional Mayan milpa. So the Lacandon and Yucatec are part of the Mayan diaspora. And milpa, I think it best I can tell, it means something like the heritage upon which we all depend.
mhm,
And in this milpa system, it begins with the slash and burn step, where tropical rainforest is cut down or ring barked, and then it's left to dry for a period of time, and then they come back and they'll burn this patch, and then that rich ash and charcoal um, has a lot of there's a lot of nutrients in there, particularly things like phosphorus, and it makes a good substrate for annual cropping to follow.
mm,
And so, the corn, beans, and squash narrative has percolated into the mainstream culture. We recognize that Native Americans were growing those three crops often together in companion plantings. But what really gets missed is this greater picture of basically full spectrum cultivation. So with the slash and burn, that's still practiced contemporarily in the Brazilian Amazon, for example, where farmers will clear away the rainforests to make way for grazing land or to make way for corn and soybeans and things like that. And but what's missed is that they're really practicing only the first initial step of an
mm,
indigenous technology. So you go down to where the milpa is still practiced by the Maya, and after they've cleared this patch in the rainforest, they're not sowing a handful of annual plants. They're sowing up to like 120 different species at the same time.
mm,
And in that suite of species, you have your annual plants, like your corn, beans, your squash, your chili peppers, your amaranths and goosefoots and things like that. Maybe some grasses. But then you also have like the short-lived perennials, like the berries and some other like fast-growing shrubs. And then you have your fast-growing timber trees that are more for just like vegetative biomass and woody material. And then you have like your fruit trees, and then, eventually you get into your nut trees. And, so there's all these waves of succession that are just waiting to unfold. And the indigenous managers of these milpas, they understand the unfolding of succession. And so after coming into these patches and sowing the annuals and all these other things, for the first 2 to 3 years, all you're really seeing is the annuals.
mm,
And then it starts to transition back into a woodland. Now, in the tropics, where you have a lot of biomass and a lot of rainfall, you can get closed canopy forest again in like 4 years. Now, that's not what they call high forest. That takes, a couple more decades of steering and succession. But the milpa workers, they're often doing a lot of like cutting of vegetation during this time. So as you can imagine, sowing that many seeds together, you get a lot of things all happening at once. And so it's actually very much like what's now called syntropic agriculture,
mhm,
where there's like a lot of chop and drop and just a lot of. Now, I'm sure the Maya these days are using a lot of machetes, but prior to colonization, that might have been done with like stone stone axes and things like that for ring barking trees and maybe like obsidian blades for cutting vegetation. But why am I using this example of the Maya for Eastern North America broadly? So we see the same. suite of species in the East. And we also see that cultural motif is discussed. And it's kind of hidden. It's one of these things that's hidden in plain sight.
Mm.
So like among the Cherokee, you've got like the green corn dance or the story of the green corn goddess. And that's a story that I'm going to paraphrase. So I'm not going to tell the full story, but in that story, the human is they're hunting and they're gathering and they're taking all these foods from the wild and they're killing all these animals and they start to run out. The animals start to their populations start to diminish and the plants they start to diminish. And so they're kind of at this dilemma and at this trying time and they're thinking like, well, how are we going to move forward? All these things are going away. And then they meet the green corn goddess and she basically says, you know, you will take my body and you will sacrifice me. You will you will chop up my body into pieces and you will then or you will kill me and you will burn me and then you will chop my body up into pieces and you will spread it over the ground and then you will wait a certain amount of time and then all the animals and the beings will come back. We look at that story on a superficial level and it's just kind of this almost bizarre story of sacrifice. But what that story is actually communicating is that the green tortoise, the green corn goddess is kind of like Mother Nature herself, and it's a it's a lesson in this shifting cultivation way, where you
Mm.
come into the forest and you cut it down and then you burn it, and then you come through and you scatter all the seeds again, and you steward the succession up there, and so corn has become like kind of the figurehead of this style of agriculture because it's the most prominent thing you see. It's the annual. It's the first thing that's going to come up in the succession. And corn being such an important staple food, it's honored for all these reasons. But you go down to Mesoamerica today, and corn is just like the tip of the iceberg.
Mm.
And so it was surely the same way in Eastern North America. As you mentioned, like the maize didn't really make it into the Eastern seaboard until quite recently. Actually, when the colonists came to Jamestown in like 16, what was it, 1632, 1640, there were two distinct kinds of corn that were traded in Jamestown. You had the 8-row Southern Dent, and then you had the Northern Flints. And as you can imagine with corn, if they had been grown together in that place for, any number of years, they would have hybridized and it would have been more of a landrace form. But the fact that they had these two distinct types just shows how new corn was to the scene.
Mm. Mm.
Um, prior to the widespread adoption of maize-based agriculture in Eastern North America, you had what's called the Eastern Agricultural Complex.
Mm-hmm.
So this was crops like maygrass and goosefoots. There's one called Iva annua, which I think is sumpweed,
Mm-hmm.
and there's probably a host of other plants. And where archaeologists have found the remains of these plants, they're very sometimes dramatically outside of where their native habitats ought to be. So, for example, sumpweed is native to like the floodplain areas along creeks and rivers in open habitats, kind of like semi-marshland, bogland, basically where you have um, like alluvial flats
Mm.
surrounding the rivers. But they would find Iva Inua up in the uplands. And so the postulation there is that the humans carried that plant through trade and intentional cultivation into these different contexts, and we see that with all of the Eastern agricultural complex crops. They were traded widely. In fact, there's some speculation that like the quinoa that traditionally has its center of origin in South America only became possible when North American chenopods were traded down along those pathways into
Mm.
I guess the Peruvian Andes, because they seem to have been hybridized with the North American chenopods. Um, Now, of course, I'm talking about these like plant migration events, that these human assisted migration events, and I'm talking about hybridizations and all that, but that's not directly demonstrating that slash and burn agriculture was practiced. The reason why I think the slash and burn agriculture was indeed practiced as it is in the Mayan Milpa is because where you find these archaeological settlements where Native Americans were, the tree canopy can often be very different from the baseline of the native species that are there. There's a place I go to in Franklin County, Pennsylvania, that's along a Native American pathway, and in the forests along the creek there, you have almost pure stands of shellbark and shagbark hickory, and but you also see black walnut, bur oak, chinkapin oak, pawpaw, persimmon, honey locust, and then like the hills immediately above it where it's like the shale and the northern hardwoods, you'll see birches and hemlocks and oaks.
Mm.
And it's like a hard cutoff. Like you have all these crazy human staple trees right along the creek, and then immediately adjacent, it's just a completely different native forest. And so I take all that as evidence that the trees were the tree composition was influenced by native folks. And the most effective way to do that on a landscape scale is going to be through slash and burn agriculture.
Mm.
So another related reference I would highlight here is William Ballier did a really interesting floristic study of the Amazon. His book is called Cultural Forests of the Amazon. And in that study, he's basically going to all these areas that are considered high forest in the Amazon, which has connotations of being like virgin rainforest. Now, whether a rainforest is actually virgin or not, that's not really something you can prove. But the idea is it's like big, impressive, majestic old growth trees and like these rich, super highly diverse communities in the Amazon. And so for ages and ages, um, in our contemporary history and contemporary thought, it's just been assumed that that's the native forest, that that's just primeval vegetation, separate from human actions. But he uh, he based this floristic study with comparisons with LiDAR scans. So he's finding like where there were old farmed fields in the Amazon, and he's also looking at cultural practices, cultural um, ideas, linguistics, ethnology, and things like that. And he basically comes to the conclusion that the vast majority of the Amazon rainforest is entirely anthropogenic. And I think that the entirety of the Eastern temperate forest was a very similar phenomenon.
Mm.
Um, you've got these oak hickory forests. I mean, that's sort of a definitional ecotype in Eastern North America is the oak hickory forest. And you won't you won't have oak hickory forests unless you have frequent fire regimes, so fast short return fire regimes. So like in the Northeast, for example, if you rely on lightning strikes alone and just kind of acts of nature, fire might pass through some areas every 200 years, sometimes even longer stretches. And in the southeast, it can be much more frequent, like in the longleaf pine savanna and the southeastern coastal plain. Just relying on lightning alone, sometimes you can have fire return intervals that are like as short as 5 years, sometimes even shorter. But the fire record in Eastern North America is showing that, like with a study of witness trees and things like that, is showing that there were quite frequent return intervals for fire all over the eastern United States, even in places with like cold climates and high rainfall and like, you know, where it's just extremely unexpected.
Yeah,
And
the
that's the
window of
legacy of
opportunity for
anthropogenic fire.
the window of opportunity for the fires establishing in those locations is very short. So yeah, does this lead you to suspect that human management of ecosystems goes way further back in our history, and the transition to intensive agriculture, like it's kind of this miracle that it appeared in multiple places independently in inverted commas. Do you think there was actually a deeper tradition waiting to transform into, the narrower modern definition of agriculture when the conditions were right?
Totally. Yeah, I think like our theories about the origins of agriculture are really hampered by a narrow perspective that we kind of assume that all this stuff began like maybe 10,000 years ago, maybe 8,000 years ago, depending on where in the world it was. But we're now seeing in the archaeological record very clear evidence of what they call pre-domestication cultivation. So, for example, in like the Yellow River Valley in China, I think going back 23,000 years, they've found evidence of rice cultivation,
Mm,
and this would have been not the modern rice, but like one of the wild progenitor species, probably Rhiza rufipogon. And then in the Near East, there's this archaeological site called Ohalo. It's referred to as Ohalo 2, and there's been a lot of work there uncovering just a whole suite of species that seem to have been cultivated, but this is before the Neolithic Revolution. So this is going back. So I actually have a timeline here. I can look this up. Yeah, Ohalo 2 is also 23,000 years ago.
mm.
They found evidence of like brome grains, Bromus pseudobrachystachys, wild barley, millet. Those are just a few of them. But then you can go even further back, and there's a cave in Georgia, the Zidzuana Cave. This is 30,000 years ago, where they found textiles. So these flax fibers were spun, woven, and dyed. And it's around the
Wow.
same time that like the first eyed needles show up.
Hmm.
I think let's see, the first eyed needles, I think that was like 36,000 years ago, something like that. You
Well,
find evidence of like fiber thread and rope working like 40,000 years ago at least.
Um,
Um,
I believe they recently found wooden foundations for a structure too that go back to like Homo erectus, like the and related thing. Recently I discovered that when grain-based agriculture appeared around the world, it wasn't just that the climate got warmer, but the seasonality was at the highest it had been for a very, very long time. So it meant you had regions where you had a really, really fertile growing season where it was warm and moist and things grew like crazy. But then there was a really inhospitable dry or cold season at the other end of the year. And under those conditions, fast growing annuals were pretty much your best bet that had a storable uh, energy source at the end of it that you could get through the bad season. Those conditions are going away as the planet changes the way it wobbles. And it makes me wonder if tree crops and root crops are going to be much more important in the future. And the other factor is that the CO2 levels have been increased, and different kinds of plants respond differently to carbon dioxide in the air. And grasses are generally really good at getting by with low carbon dioxide levels, whereas broadleaf plants, tree and root crops, tend to do much better at higher CO2 levels. So I wonder if that is all pushing us towards a kind of agro forestry system with understory root crops as being the next most successful model of how to live on this planet.
yeah. Um, I love that thought. I agree with you personally. I think the more biodiversity you can build into your ecosystem, into your subsistence ecosystem, the better. I think there's always going to be a place for the annuals because with increasing climatic instability, sometimes your harvest on the tree crops isn't as consistent as you would like, or as fruitful as you would like. So um, I just want to be focused on the whole palette of subsistence rather than saying like annual crops are the answer over here on this end of the spectrum, or jumping all the way to the other side and saying tree crops are the answer over here. I think we're always going to need both. And you were giving an example of climatic changes. What was the time period of that again?
Well, about 10,000 years ago was when you had that peak
10,000 years
in,
ago.
yeah, that's when you had the peak in seasonality, and shortly after, grass-based civilizations pop up in multiple places.
Yeah, you also had an explosion in human population.
Mm,
So this idea of cultivation being so much older than than is thought, like older than 10,000 years, it's got a lot of there's a lot of implications here. Like I mentioned, oh Halo and the Yellow River Valley for rice and Near Eastern grains. But oh, I think I lost my point.
that's okay. That's okay. Well, another thing I find really interesting is that the ancestors of maize, teosinte, they came from an original hybridization of two wild grass species, were grown for thousands of years in a little tiny valley in Mexico, didn't make much of a splash. They looked pretty much like teosinte today. And then there was a third hybridization event. This is only a recent paper that's discovered this, that triggered the transformation into what we now know as maize. And it was so different compared to its ancestral species, and it just exploded across firstly New World and then across the Old World once they got their hands on it. And it makes me wonder if maize might be the only fully domesticated plant in our agricultural systems, that it's so transformed and it's so dependent on humans. And going one step further, what would a fully domesticated oak or hickory tree or a chestnut tree look like? Is there like another hybridization that on the surface you would think that's not going to make much of a difference, could completely transform them in a way that makes them as different from teosinte as maize is?
Yeah, so there's two thoughts there. One is about maize hybridization, and the other one is about like the possibilities of like hickory domesticated hickory forests, for
Hmm.
example.
Mm.
So first, I want to address the maize point. What you're talking about with like the third hybridization, like really kicking off this acceleration, is so true. We also see that with like the triticums in the Levantine region
Hmm.
of West
Hmm.
Asia. Like a lot of the first founder crops, like the wild emmers and things like that, were really these kind of species amalgamations of several different species or subspecies that were in different locations, often separated by mountains and rivers and things like that. And through human assisted migration, they were able to hybridize and become this third thing, which eventually became the domesticated species. But I want to point out in the case of maize, I think its history is even more recent than we know. So in the archaeology, like the colonial era archaeology prior to the 1800s, most maize in North America was actually quite small. Like the cobs would have
Mm.
been maybe about the size of your finger, and like with the kernels on them, they might have been like 4 to 6 inches long, or maybe a little bit bigger. But they were small, and it was what they would call like Indian corn. Um, like what we know of as modern maize, which is like this foot long thing that's like at least 2 inches across and just like totally covered in in kernels. That's quite a modern phenomenon that arose in the 1800s in what
Hmm.
they called like, I guess, scientific agriculture. So what happened is when the settlers started to push into the Midwest, and took on maize agriculture as like their main crop, there had just been so much mixing of different seeds for corn. Like you had the flint corn out of the north mixing with the dent corn from the south, and then you had other kinds of flour corn and popcorn, and all these different types got together, and um, people started to notice that certain certain phenotypes started to show up in in their corn, and eventually that would become like modern progenitors like Reed's yellow dent, which I think was like mid to late 1800s that emerged, and it won a whole bunch of contests, and everybody started growing seed of that, and that's most closely related to, like, it's most closely reminiscent of what we think of as modern dent corn, at least in size and shape and all that. But
Interesting.
so there's actually kind of been a much more modern domestication of maize, and it was that domestication that happened in the colonial era in the Midwest that then enabled that to become a globally traded crop that then, is now like the major staple all around the world.
Mm.
As far as like a domesticated forest of tree crops, I think we had it. I think there are still some legacy trees remaining from that time. If I had to give an analogy of what it was like, it was rather like the wild walnut forests of Central Asia.
Hmm.
Over there, they have wild walnut apple forests, wild apple forests, and they've seen this most clearly in the apple genetics. I don't know that they've studied the walnut genetics as much, but in the apples, they have these wild species they call Malus sieversii and Malus niedwitskiana, um, often thought of as like the original the original population that apple came from, and that it's been dispersed out of there. But I think Cornell University's done a lot of work in this. The genetics shows that those apple populations are largely hybrid swarms, and that you had all these, yeah, you had
It's
these crab apples
it's
in like
hybrids all the way
West.
down.
Yeah, it's hybrids all the way down, right? I even heard a story that I haven't been able to confirm, so take it with a grain of salt. But this idea of Malus sieversii being a distinct species, when they analyzed that genetically, they couldn't find anything essential about it, and it just seemed to be another hybrid. So you had all these crabapple populations in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and then in China and other parts of Asia and of Eurasia. And with the ancient Silk Road pathway and all the trade that happened along that corridor, inevitably crabapple seeds from West Asia would have opportunities to mate with crab apples from East Asia. And that radically opened up the genome. And it just so happens that Central Asia is right in the middle.
Mm.
And that's basically the domestication story of the apple. Now, like I said, with the walnuts, I'm not aware that that's been tested genetically to the same level as the apples have, but you can find accounts of people going into like the wild apple walnut forests in Central Asia, and they talk about how the walnuts are all kinds of different sizes, different shapes, sometimes different colors. Um, and it's very much like a hybrid swarm. And so I would expect that once genetic analysis is done on the wild walnuts out in Central Asia, you're also going to find a similar thing, that there's been a lot of hybridization and translocation that's occurred. So here in the eastern US, we had the same thing that was happening with the hickories, probably also with persimmons, although that's a little bit of a different case. It was chestnuts are a little bit of a different case because they but definitely with the hickories, we see a lot of those hybrids that I mentioned earlier. And like I know a place that again is along that trading path in Pennsylvania, that native trading path where you can go into the hickory forest that's there, and within just a few acres of ground, you will find nuts that are dramatically different in size from each other. Some have shells that are like almost a quarter inch thick, and some are like paper thin, like a shagbark, and you'll find different flavors in there. Some nuts are more buttery, more savory. Some are more sweet. Some almost taste like banana bread. Some have those rich maple tones. And basically all different shapes, sizes, flavors, and that's just within a few acres. And
Mm,
knowing what I know about genetic plasticity and how it expresses in plants and crops, I see that and I think, well, there you go. There's a hybrid swarm, and that's the sign of, if not full domestication, at least semi-domestication. I guess when you consider something fully domesticated, that's when it kind of becomes something separate from its progenitor species.
mm. Well, I mean, I see maize as being fully domesticated because it's got no hope of surviving without humans, whereas teosinte self-sows pretty reliably in places that it's happy.
I mean, if the habitat's right, corn can sow itself, maize can sow itself. I don't know how long it can survive over multiple years, but I've had it come up as a volunteer in my garden.
Hmm.
Of course, that's like a very special kind of tended habitat, right? But
Mm,
I've heard stories of certain places where maize can become not fully feral, but can kind of persist a little bit.
mm. Um, I'm looking at the time passing and I'm wondering, do we have time to talk about honey locust? Because it's not a crop I get to
Sure.
talk about very often, but I want to make sure we spend some time talking about organizations and culture because it's such an important part, particularly for the long-lived crops like the tree crops. Yeah, you can't do it on your own in a lifetime. If you're happy to keep going, do you want to make time for both? Let's talk to honey locust and then we'll move on to organizations and culture.
Sure.
Okay. Honey,
Yeah, honey locust is another crop I work with. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, no, tell me. I don't even, I'm not very familiar with it, so tell me everything about it.
It's in the bean family. It makes a big fleshy bean pod on a tree,
Hmm.
basically. Um, there's two main types. There's like the razorback type and the fatback type. And if you're familiar with honey locust in the wild, you may have seen the bean pods, but you're kind of scratching your head of where the fleshy goo is because they're just so thin. But that's where the fatback types come in, where it's like this kind of honey colored goo that can be quite quite prominent in those pods. I mean, some honey locusts can be almost 40% sugar by dry weight.
Wow.
Um, and so I guess it's kind of like a Eastern temperate forest version of carob,
Hmm.
or it's kind of vaguely reminiscent of tamarind. These are other leguminous bean pod producing trees. In the eastern United States, honey locust has a strong association with Native American settlements. There's two main kinds of honey locust in terms of the thorn expression. So Gladitia triacanthos basically means like three thorns, I think, um, on the trunk. So some honey locusts can be horribly thorned, like just like really like the thorns can pop a tractor tire. They're no joke.
Mm,
But then some trees are entirely thornless. So there's a spectrum there from entirely thornless to horribly thorned, and then from razorback pods to really fat, fleshy pods. And as an agroforestry, like our interest is in the fat, fleshy pods and the thornless tree.
mm.
Um,
Are they difficult to
th
dry down for storage? Like how are the pods actually used by humans?
the pods drop in late fall, so here they sometimes they don't even really drop until like November or December, even into January. Um, and then they'll just naturally dry out if you leave them off the ground. So if you just if you leave them on the ground, the rains come, the snow comes, and they'll eventually break down. But as long as they're stored in a dry space, they'll naturally dehydrate really easily.
Mm,
Um, in contemporary agroforestry, they're mostly used for silvopasture because they're just like a really great stockpile tree. They produce their sugar and their protein in the off season when the grasses aren't really growing. So they're just a really good supplemental feed for livestock like cows and sheep and pigs and things like that.
mm,
So that's where most of the interest in honey locust is that I receive that like when people come to me interested in honey locust, it's usually for silvopasture. Uh, Personally, I'm pretty invested in working with it as a human crop. The flavor of the honey inside the honey locust, it's rather like apple cider.
Hmm.
It can be a little bit spicy sometimes. It could be more mild, almost like apple banana sauce or something like that.
Wow.
Um, I'm not sure how to extract the sugar into like a elemental form, but the pods, once dried, can be ground into a powder that's rather like carob powder. And my partner uses that in baking, and when she cooks with it, it's like so good. It's just like a really good sweetener. It would be good for cutting chocolates with. And you can just eat the powder. I mean, it's good. It's basically like I mean, it's a sugary powder. You
Interesting.
can also you can eat the pods raw, of course. They're good in brewing, so a lot of people use them in like beer and wine and things like that.
What a fantastic plant. I know it's banned here because of its invasive and spiny potential. So we don't get to play around with it in
Interesting.
Australia. Yeah, we're pretty paranoid about anything that is shows potential for spreading overseas. But I wondered if it's a great archetype of a plant that originally evolved for certain types of megafauna. So a lot of fruit trees are like they have poisonous or spiny foliage. They grow to a shorter size and then they produce abundant amounts of like sugary fruit at various times of the year with large hard seeds in them. And I wonder if that is like a lot of these fruiting plants, we've kind of inherited them from extinct megafauna in the past, and I wonder if there's any evolutionary implications there.
Yeah, totally. There's that book, Ghosts of Evolution by Connie Barlow, who actually also works with the Toria Society, saving the Toria taxifolia. It's like another like relict species in the southeast that may have had a megafaunal relationship. But she writes about how like the honey locust was dispersed by giant ground sloths and things like that.
Hmm.
And the thorns that the honey locust puts out are basically repellent against mastodon. The difference between the mammoth and the mastodon is the mammoth is the bigger animal that has like the low swooping tusks because it would sweep the snow aside and to find vegetation and in the process it would build permafrost. Whereas the mastodon was instead of being a grazer, it was more of a browser.
Hmm.
And so the mastodons would kind of go into the woodland and they would push trees over and try to eat all the leaves or eat the pods and things like that. And so when you're basically dealing with an elephant trying to push you over, thorns are the best defense. So those the thorns on the honey locust were there to repel the mastodon.
Interesting. And this gets me into a management question. Do you think there are limitations or challenges managing agroforestry systems without large animals? Like the megafauna that's been lost used to be so important. And like we see in places in like Southeast Asia where elephants are still around, they play a really vital role in um, managing the dynamics of the forest over time. And are humans kind of trying to play catch up with their little chainsaws and axes?
Yeah, it's a great question. Um, I mean, humans are we're just such a versatile species, and we do a lot of biomimicry. So, if a particular species goes extinct, we will often take on their niche and try to fulfill it in the best ways that we can. I mean, sometimes negatively, sometimes positively. If that species is present, um, yeah, this is a tough question to answer because I think human beings just being as resilient as we are, I don't know where the line is between like the needing these other species to manage the forest for us versus us just managing in the ways that we want. Certainly, like. I want to see high biodiversity. I don't want to see any extinctions. I want to see, as much life as this planet can sustain.
Mm,
And so I think your question is it's sort of getting against this idea of the overkill hypothesis and
mm,
like, have how far back and to what extent have human beings been involved in the extinction of certain megafauna? And there's an argument that's made. I'm pretty neutral about overkill hypothesis. I tend to think that it's overplayed in a lot of ways, but one of the hypotheses there, one of the theories is that when human beings started to use fire on the landscape in really extensive ways, that altered the habitat so extensively that some of the megafauna, such as the woolly mammoth, for example, or the mastodon, they just couldn't really compete, couldn't continue to compete in those environments, and that's what contributed to their demise.
mm,
So in that situation, you have human ecosystem engineering actually promoting the extinction of certain megafaunal species. So I'm trying to think of an inverse example of that, where having certain megafauna has helped human subsistence. And I guess I would look at Africa to the Kalahari in particular. So there's the work of an anthropologist I really appreciate. Her name's Helga Vierik. She was a student of Richard Borshay Lee, doing her PhD, I think in the 70s or 80s in the Kalahari Desert, and she kept coming against this like all these bush hunters. They never wanted to kill a giraffe, and she's like, well,
ah,
why? Like, why do you have this taboo against killing a giraffe? And they would say, oh, well, we don't know, it's, tradition, whatever. Eventually they pointed her in the direction of this old woman, and she went and visited with this woman, and she asked her query, why is there a taboo against killing the giraffe? And the woman said, the giraffe is the midwife to the acacia tree.
mm-hmm,
And and then it all clicked for Helga Vierik. She realized that, only the giraffe has a neck that's long enough to reach the pods of the acacia tree, and by passing through its GI tract, it gives those trees an opportunity to germinate. And the acacia is like a very significant keystone tree of that region in Africa. And
mm,
so if you kill the giraffes, you impair the tree, and so on and so forth down the line. And so that attitude towards life is really beautiful, and it's something that I think we should all aspire aspire to. In our ecosystem, for example, we have an overpopulation of white-tailed deer,
mm-hmm,
and that is it's largely because of an absence of certain predators, in particular the wolf and the black bear.
mm,
People don't often think of bears as predators of deer, and in a classic sense, they're not, because a bear, is first of all not going to be able to really catch a deer, and second of all, bears are more opportunist carnivores. They're omnivorous, and they'll eat meat if they come across it and it's easy, but they're not really hunters per se. But bears, being denizens of the deep forest, um, th when they come across like a fawn, for example, the fawns have this habit where when the mother's off foraging and she's left the fawn alone, they'll often just bed down. They'll find some vegetation, they'll just lay close to the ground, and they'll be basically motionless until their mother comes back, and then they start to run around again. So the bears will come across the fawns when they're out foraging, and they'll eat the fawns. And so bears, being denizens of the deep forest, they basically push the deer out.
mm,
They keep them out of the woods, and that enables more natural regeneration to take place and things like that. On the other hand, you've got like the mountain lions. I didn't mention them, but they're part of the balance too. You've got the mountain lions, you got the bobcats, you've got the wolves, which here in the eastern United States, we had we had a species of true wolf that has since gone extinct. It's back in like the Adirondacks region and places like Wisconsin and stuff like that. But down in the southeast, they had before extinction what they called brush wolves, which may have actually been a hybrid between coyote and wolf. So
Mm.
extremely similar to the coy dogs that the coy wolves that we now have now like repopulated in every basically every even major city in the eastern United States. And those are wolf coyote dog hybrids.
Hmm.
So it's nature's solution to fill the vacuum. But basically with the wolves, they're more of an open habitat kind of hunter. And then you've got the mountain lions who can they can go both ways. The bobcats are kind of like that. They can go both ways. And so with the influence of the feline and canid predators, that would push the deer back towards the forest.
Mm.
And so with the dynamic balance of the bears and the open land predators, that keeps the deer to their habitat, which is that ruderal mid-succession landscape that's often like the ecotone between forest and prairie. And so it's just like those kinds of influences have such a profound effect. Now here in the East, we've tried to kill every mountain lion that we can find, and every wolf that we can find, and in many places there aren't even resident bear populations unless you like get into the mountains and places like that. And so we have this deer overpopulation problem, and it,
Mm.
it can't be solved by hunting. So
Mm.
it's just these little things that we need to look at and evaluate if we want to have more resilient ecosystems that ultimately are going to be more anti-fragile and more able to bring a yield and a surplus, which, if we're humans practicing like a full spectrum subsistence where we're not just relying on like a handful of domesticated annual crops, but we're eating tree crops, we're eating spring ephemerals, we're eating wild herbaceous plants, we're eating domesticated garden plants and all of the above, and grains and grasses and all that. If we have that full spectrum subsistence, that's going to be fortified. Like the stronger our ecosystems are, the
Yeah.
the better everything's going to be.
Well, I mean, I'm curious if you have any thoughts about the integration of animals into agroforestry, because as I see it, the major domesticated species in our repertoire are grassland species, with the exception probably of the pig. Maybe, I mean, turkeys, I guess, originally were an example of an agroforestry domesticated animal from Northern America. And I just wonder if there's other opportunities for domesticating animals, particularly like while we're in this period of industrial abundance, the ability to move species around, to husband them, to get them through that difficult early stage of breeding. That may not be something we can do forever.
Yeah. Um, well, certain animals are used in like agroforestry contexts. For example, like chickens can often be used as chickens and ducks together can be used as like a pest control for everything from slugs to chestnut weevils. Um, there's, I mean, draft animals are like a really big elephant in the room. Um, there's a lot of Amish communities around where I live, and they're horse powered. They're part of Horse Nation,
Mm.
and it's really neat to see that. Um, and then there's things like donkeys, which can act as like guard animals. There's llamas and alpacas, which can either be like a fiber producing animal or sometimes used as a guard animal. Um, Yeah, I think I've heard in other podcasts you talk about the window for domesticating like the African and the Asian elephants together.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah,
I'm a
I don't know
big
that we have
proponent of that
anything.
theory.
Yeah, I think it's really a cool idea. I don't think we have anything in our ecosystem that's quite like that per se.
Mm.
Um,
I mean,
but
Australia and
good
North
food for thought.
America and South America too had like the most thorough megafauna extinctions. Like Australia has been, like our terrestrial ecosystem, I think has been broken for about 40,000 years. And in North America, I think you lost them about 15,000 years ago. Most of the extinctions happened. And we seem to have a picture where megafauna were crucial for managing particularly forest ecosystems, and those species in particular were the most completely lost during the die-off that happened in the last tens of thousands of years. And humans with fire seem to have done their best with that tool to rebalance the forest to come up with a different way of managing the growth cycles. But I wonder if it's the only way that humans could manage forest systems, that we might have an opportunity to domesticate other animals that are more naturally suited to forests, like elephants, in this window of opportunity.
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, I think anything's possible. Anything's
Hmm.
possible, especially in this era where assisted migration is going to be more and more important as we go into like climatic uncertainties. Um, there are certain species that their home range is threatened, but you can move them to another part of the earth and they'll thrive. Um, Now I don't know where the crossover is with that and like ecosystem services or however you want to phrase that, like giving giving benefit to that will down the line affect positively human subsistence. But I mean, like let's look at elephants for example. Even though the African elephant is in Africa and the Asian elephant's in Asia, if you hybridize them you might end up with an animal that has a much wider habitat that it can thrive in, a
Hmm.
wider variety of habitats that it can thrive in, and maybe they could even thrive in the Americas. And on that note, I guess what's worth mentioning here, just since we're talking about like movements of species over time, like the horse is native to North America, and then it supposedly traveled across the Bering Land Bridge into Asia and then died out in North America, allegedly, and then was reintroduced by the Spaniards. And now we have these huge feral horse populations all across North America, and they're considered a non-native invasive species that, to the point where they're like poisoned and shot and killed and, all these
Hmm.
things, which to me is just nonsense because it's basically a returned native species. But
Hmm.
we see the same thing with camels, I believe. Like
Yep.
camels
Mm.
and the dromedaries are also North American species originally, and so their closest relatives that still live in the Americas are like the llamas and the alpacas. But like the your classic like Arabian camel, um, they are part of a lineage that has its birthplace in the Americas.
Hmm. Hmm.
And yeah, and obviously they're like a super economically important animal relationship that we carry. It's a important mutualism. Um, I don't know if it's possible to make like a wide cross between like a llama and a camel or something like that. But that's kind of where my mind is going right now. Like, yeah, I mean, llamas and alpacas were really important for some like Peruvian and Mesoamerican civilizations because of yeah, as pack animals, and you know, conceivably we could maybe
Well,
maybe
two
relate with
quick
them like
points
that
on
again.
that. Two quick points on that. I am hoping to interview someone, a researcher in the Middle East, who is hybridizing camels and alpacas and llamas.
Oh,
And I
cool.
recently found out that the domestic camel was only really took off when they hybridized dromedaries and camels, the one and the two hump. Because the Bactrians and the dromedaries, one's from a cold habitat, one's from a hot habitat, and when they crossed
Uh-huh.
them, that's when camel as a useful animal took off. And another little point with the horse is that we would have no horses today if they hadn't have been domesticated. They were the wild ancestors for horses were hunted to extinction, and there was a lucky window of opportunity where one tribe figured out how to turn them from, these very flighty, very nervous wild animals that they hunted into first, I think they raised them for meat and then milk, and then much later for riding. So yeah, I don't know. I just every opportunity I get to suggest that we could do the same thing to elephants before they go extinct, because they are on track to go extinct. If you look at the long history of elephant species, it's been nothing but down. And they might seem like a kind of ordinary creature today, but their future is not guaranteed if we just hope that they can make it in the wild.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm,
There's even there's old ancient horse hybrids. There's like the Kungas, which is like a it's like a wild ass hybrid. It's
hmm
like a hybrid between I guess I don't know if the what domestic horse is featured in that, um but yeah, there's all this stuff and it's
It's an exciting time to be alive.
yeah,
Now,
it is for sure.
I've kept you a really long time. We have to talk about organizations and culture because you have an
Okay.
unusual uh, talent and range of experience with multiple different organizations dealing with regenerative, sustainable agriculture, crop breeding, like multiple things, and harvesting and using of these crops as well too. Like you're doing it across the board. So, do you have any observations from all of these different experiences? What factors help organizations to be effective and long lasting?
Well, uh I'd love to answer that question in 10 years. Um, I mean, there's so many factors. I mean, the big screaming elephant in the room at this point would be financial viability,
hmm
which unfortunately is just part of the world we live in. So, it's gotta make sense financially. Otherwise, you're gonna be climbing uphill,
Mm.
and it's you're never gonna experience that downhill climb or that downhill descent until, some of that stuff can fall into line as it should. Um,
Well, the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative is probably the best case study of that. Like, can you tell me more about how you like planned and strategized to make that an economically viable entity? And
well, that's been a very
explain
col
what it does for people who haven't heard of it.
yeah, it's been a very collaborative process all along the way. So the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative began recognizing that there was a need in our economic landscape for a way to work with tree crops specifically for making value-added products such as like the hickory oil that I mentioned earlier, in a way that's accessible to people because you know people like you and I and probably many of the listeners of this show, like we're involved with the land, we're involved with growing, we're involved with plants, but we often have so much going on that we don't have the capacity to or the wherewithal to like turn certain crops into value-added product. And sometimes that limitation is a financial limitation. Like, for example, with the hickory oil, like unless you have access to the capital to buy and import a an oil pressing machine and then all the machines that complement it, um, it's kind of a non-starter. And so especially for like a market that isn't fully realized yet. Like it's a big risk. And whether you have the money or not, it's still a risk. And so wouldn't it be great if we could all like unify ourselves under a single banner, recognizing that, we can make something greater than the a whole that's greater. And so that's where the cooperative idea came into play for the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative. So that's a double entendre because Pennsylvania is the Keystone State, and we think that something like tree crops cooperative can serve as like a keystone for the tree-based economy. And so our cooperative began in a very grassroots way as friends having conversations about, how this idea can work. We had been inspired by some other cooperatives and examples like that, like tree crop processing facilities that were like kind of collaborative in nature. There's like the Nutty Buddy Collective down in North Carolina, which is also branded in some places as the Acornucopia Project. And then there's like the NITCA, which is the New York Tree Crops Alliance up in the Finger Lakes area of New York. And so we wanted to create something similar to that in Pennsylvania. So for a couple years, we were sort of like these ad hoc steering committee meetings, and a lot of ideas were discussed. And eventually, we were able to coalesce into some formalized bylaws, and we incorporated in the state of Pennsylvania. And now we're a few years into our incorporation, and we have a lease on a commercial processing facility, and we've gotten some grant funding to purchase like $100,000 in equipment. And we have this place, and we've got an elected board of directors, and yeah, all this stuff, but it's still so new, and there's so many moving pieces, and there's still so much need for more capacity in the personnel world. Like we still need more designated people to fulfill certain roles, because the idea of a co-op is that like one person isn't going to do everything. One
Mm.
person isn't going to do multiple roles. One person's going to find their niche, and for, to to put it candidly, just kind of stay in their lane and contribute in the best ways that they can, serving that role. And so like my role in the co-op, I'm the processing director. So I work with the oil press machine, and I make the hickory oil. But we've hired somebody to fulfill that role, so that my job can become much more irrelevant, which is great.
Mm.
Maybe not irrelevant, much more redundant. That's a nicer way to
Yeah,
put
yeah, yeah, yeah.
it.
Well,
Yeah,
that's a form of
um,
resiliency, isn't it? That if that person
exactly,
ever steps out of that role and you can't quickly find someone else to do it, you could step back in to like paper over the gap.
exactly, right. And so we have like an administrative director. We've got like a treasurer, secretary. It's an organization, and then we've got producer members. So we've got, oh, I don't know where we're at membership now. It's over 15 producer members. So these are people who grow or are sometimes aspiring to grow tree crops that they can bring to harvest and sell to us as a co-op. And then we have the equipment to process it into a value-added product. And then we've got the licensing and all that to make it a legally saleable product. So that's the co-op in its big, broad brushstrokes. Now you're asking about the sustainability of an organization, and we're still in that startup phase. So it's hard to think about the long-term sustainability. I have faith and hope that's going to be our story if you talk to me in 10 years. And
Mm,
I'm excited for all the things that the future brings, but it doesn't feel like the kind of conversation that I can honestly come to with tips for being sustainable. I can tell you what's worked for us right now, and like kind of advice if
mm,
other folks are interested in
mm,
starting organizations. And I'd say that the main thing is just to be very clear on roles and responsibilities,
mm,
especially when you have multiple people involved, like multi-stakeholder. It's one thing to just be like a owner-operator business, or like a very close-knit group of like vertically integrated employer employee relationships, where there's sort of like a command structure, and you know there can be a lot of clarity around that,
mm,
for sometimes better, sometimes for worse, but that. it's generally like there's not a lot of ambiguity there. Whereas when you get more people involved in like a multi-stakeholder cooperative where, we're aspiring for a more horizontal form of leadership, it's just really important that you start those conversations with the right people because there is such a thing as too many cooks in the kitchen.
Hmm.
And there, which is also said is like too many chiefs, not enough warriors. You gotta have like clear boundaries of like where people's responsibilities are. And I think that, acceptance of limits can bring about a lot of abundance. So
Hmm.
abundance comes from limitations.
Yeah.
And so I would embrace that as I would give that as advice, like embrace that. Find where you can really plug in and be of service to like a greater organizational whole and find good complements for that. Um, and I say this just to highlight that like in the tree crops world, for example, like I run a nursery, a tree crops nursery, and I've got other friends and colleagues who run tree crops nurseries, and like we can keep our hands in the dirt and we can geek out about the species and we can gather the nuts and we can do this and that. But if you're trying to build a cooperative that's going to be a sustainable business around a whole bunch of those people, um, you're just going to find yourself lacking in other ways that are necessary. I mean, a co-op requires a lot of communication, and it kind of calls us to create a connective tissue that can unite all the different, sometimes disparate components of the value stream and like the whole process of all that goes into that from basically producer to consumer. I mean, you've got the producers, you've got the the processors, the marketers, the distributors, the consumers, there's all these different
Mm.
parts of the supply chain. And we like we can't fulfill all those roles. And so, in the early stages, it's gonna be difficult sometimes to find like who is your core group of people that are aligned on values and are able to roll up their sleeves and do the work that needs to be done to create that structure that then can welcome in more people.
Hmm. Hmm.
For example, like speaking for myself, like my role in the cooperative, like since I was there from the beginning, like I was involved in like the visioning and it's and my skill set kind of puts with like the oil pressing and stuff puts me in like the technician specialist role. And I don't have the chops to handle a lot of the administrative stuff and like some of the communication stuff and the marketing stuff. And so you often find that in a lot of startups and entrepreneurial endeavors, they're often started by like visionaries who have like a great idea and have like competence in a certain like skill set and like a certain way of doing things, but they're not enough to actually bring the whole vision into fruition.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any insights from the Northern Nut Growers Association? Because it's been running, I think, since the 60s or 70s. How have they
Northern Nut
managed?
Growers has been around since 1910.
Oh, there you go, even longer. So,
Yeah.
are there any hints about like how they set up and structured and operated that organization to allow it to run for so long?
Yeah, I mean, the NNGA is really just carried along by passion, I think. I mean, they are a nonprofit, so um, they're in that world, but um, it's an association, so it's hobbyists, some professionals, enthusiasts, things like that um, I think it's really enthusiasm that's carried us along for all these years, over 100 years now.
Mm.
There's an annual conference this year. It's going to be in Amherst, Massachusetts. If anyone's listening and is interested, I think it's going to be a really, really great time. Um, the NNGA they put on a great conference, and it's just a great gathering of the minds. And I think it's that kind of energy that's carried the organization forward. I'll also say that the NNGA has been involved in like research and publications, so they produce like a quarterly, I'm sorry, an annual journal. They do have a quarterly newsletter, but they have like an annual report that has been published since, well, the first meeting, I don't think there's a there isn't a publication for that, but since 1911,
Mm,
they've had a an annual periodical every year. And sometimes it's over 100 pages long, sometimes it's shorter than that, but it's basically a good synthesis of people's projects and their research and their interests and their thoughts and their experiences with this or that um, nut crop. I mean, it's a nut growers association that's kind of in the name, but sometimes you'll have articles about persimmons or honey locust or pawpaw or other tree crops like that. And so that literature has given the organization a rapport over the years. It's made them a recognizable name that has just been a good organization for research and education.
I mean, particularly for tree crops, you need an organization to last long enough to have an impact, I think. So that organization is really inspiring to me. So I'm very glad I got a bit of a chance to ask you about that. I also wanted to ask about the power of the culture associated with these crops and the food products that come out of them. Have you found any ways of tapping into that potential? I mean, take for example the hickory oil. It's such a unique food product. Have you helped reach out to the community by leveraging it in like the food culture around it?
Yeah. Um, well, how do I approach this question? I think one of the implications of your question is just like, have you made inroads with the community around you to generate interest around this product? Am
Hmm.
I understanding that
Yeah, yeah,
correctly?
yeah.
Yeah. Well, fortunately for us, like hickory oil is just like it just tastes so good and it's got such a cool story that it kind of sells itself, to be honest.
Mm-hmm.
Like
Mm-hmm.
when people try it and they taste it, we've never really had a reaction that's like, oh, that was that was so. It's usually like a very enthusiastic reception
Mm.
on flavor alone. And then you can get into the nutrition. The nutrition. There's been a nutritional analysis done by a colleague of ours, and that suggested that the ratio of omega fatty acids is 4 to 1, which puts it within the ideal target window for human nutrition
Mm-hmm.
and gives it an advantage over olive oil. Like the best olive oil we have on the market is something like 6 to 1. And keep in mind, like the ideal ratio is 1 to 1. So the lower the ratio there, the better it is. So hickory oil is a 4 to 1 ratio of omega fatty acids. So that's something to brag about. There's a lot of local chefs and kind of like like local farm retail outlets, and they've expressed a lot of interest in the hickory oil. We've had good sales online. We sell some hickory oil at events like conferences. Most recently, we're at the first Mid-Atlantic agroforestry conference. And we'll often sell some hickory oil at the PASA conference, which is the Pennsylvania Association for Sustainable Agriculture. I would say right now our biggest hurdle is lack of supply. The demand exceeds the supply, which is it's a good problem to have on the one hand, but it raises some challenges such as we have to be very careful not to overpromise.
Mm-hmm.
It also means we have to exercise some caution when we promote this product because we don't want to unintentionally create negative experiences where we say, "Hey, we have hickory oil for sale," and then a few days go by and someone goes on the website and it's all sold out.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some unique challenges there. So I would say overall, it's like the beginning of what could be a really incredible industry centered around the eastern temperate forests, where the yellow bud hickory tree has the potential to become someday like a globally traded commodity, just like the olive is in the Mediterranean regions for olive oil. We have the same kind of thing here, and it's a part of our native ecosystem, part of our native forest. It's got a really wide range from Florida to Canada to Texas, and it's pretty it can be very locally abundant where it's found in the right habitat, and it's got a big distribution. So it works in the short term as a wild foraged crop, but people are now starting to plant out orchards of yellow bud, which I think is wonderful. And I also have some mixed thoughts about that because we want to avoid recreating monocultures, but
Hmm.
the people who are planting out yellow bud orchards, they're of the mindset that they can see the follies of the monocultural system. So usually they're companion planted, but as this crop moves forward and develops more of a, I mean, market share for, to put it that way, people are going to plant it in big big acreage and extensive plantations. And I think that's just the nature of the game, and it's just kind of an inevitability. And that's assuming, of course, that the system doesn't experience some catastrophic shocks or anything like that. But if things continue as they are now, that's probably where we're headed, where, maybe 20, 30 years from now, maybe sooner, maybe later, yellow bud hickory oil will become a fixture of the eastern uh, eastern agricultural schema.
Just a off the top of my head question. The seed cake after you press oil, does it have any potential uses? Because as the industry scales, that could be a like a major byproduct.
Yeah, absolutely. We're exploring that as a smoking fuel for like pit roasters and things like that. It's really good. It's got a good hickory flavor for smoking meats or vegetables or things like that.
Hmm.
Um, and the feedback we've gotten so far has been pretty positive. Some of that feedback has been overwhelmingly positive. People saying like, "Oh, this is the best hickory smoke that I've ever experienced," and things like that. So we have that. Um, the hickory press cake could also be pelletized potentially, and then used as it can either be pelletized to create like more uniformity for like pit roasting, or it could potentially be used as like a fuel stock. I think that there's some potential that it could be used as maybe like a bioplastic if you could put put the press cake through like a really heavy duty extruder or something, because the residual oils that are left in the press cake, because the no process has 100% efficiency.
Mm.
Those oils will polymerize under high heat and pressure, and when they polymerize, it basically makes a bioplastic. So
Interesting.
it could potentially be like a Trex-like material. If you're familiar with Trex, it's like that, um, the plastic decking material and stuff like
Okay.
that.
Okay.
Could be maybe something similar to that. It could also potentially be an animal feed.
Mm.
Now it's too bitter to be a pure animal feed, but if it was diluted into another mixture, maybe let's say like one part out of 100, like 1% of the mixture, maybe a little higher, 2 or 5%, but a low percentage, it could go a long way because there is a lot of protein in there. There's a lot of and even the tannic acid itself, if you're feeding it to livestock like cows, for example, that tannic acid can tonify their system and
Yeah, it can be
kind of
beneficial in the right dose.
totally.
Mm.
And on that
Interesting.
note, we've also had some interest expressed to us for the nutraceuticals world, where it would be kind of a similar concept, but turned into a nutraceutical for human consumption.
Interesting. Interesting. I knew there was I knew there was something worth digging into there. Now, I've kept you a really long time. We should probably wrap this up. I have two final fun questions that I ask pretty much all of my guests, and hopefully you know them, but for anyone else, if you could create a new life form, like with a wave of a magic wand, is there anything particular that you'd want to wish into the world?
If I was going to create a new life form, I'd probably make some kind of like easily um easily cultivatable microbe that eats plastic.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That would be fun. Um
I think there's people working on that. It could just be a matter of time before it appears.
yeah, or something that could just like really clean up water. Well, we have this already. We've got like mussels and the freshwater mussels and clams and all that.
Mm.
That's a tough one. I mean, like there's so much life on our planet already, and like I mean, we don't have to look to outer space for aliens or anything like that. We can just go to the bottom of the ocean or just explore the wild, crazy life that's here. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, that's a
Um,
fun question.
and the sister question to that, if you could create a new cultural technology, and that could be a tradition or an organization or an art form or a religion, if you're feeling ambitious, like is there anything you think the world needs that you would love to, if you had another lifetime that you'd get about to creating?
Yeah, I think culture is really, really important, and having a community with shared beliefs and values is extremely powerful. And I mentioned earlier, like I live in an area where there's a lot of Amish and Mennonite communities, and I don't share their religious beliefs, and there's aspects of their culture that, I if you asked me about it, I would have critical things to say, but that's not my point here. Like, we have friends and neighbors who are Amish, and like they're wonderful people. Um, and they have a community cohesiveness that is just like enviable. I mean, if you've ever seen like an Amish barn raising, it's like a work of art in terms of like the choreography, and everybody knows their role, and they can just like put a barn or a house together. Like if somebody in the community loses their house to a fire, they practically have it rebuilt like within a week. They have an amazing ability to leverage resources and finances, and basically they're buying up all the farmland around us,
Mm,
and which is good in a lot of ways because it saves it from development, from not only suburban sprawl, but things like data centers, which are now trying to encroach on where we live. And the reason the Amish are able to do what they do is because they're all together. They're a cohesive culture. And that's something that we've really lost in the modern world. We're all like atomized individuals, and we all have different values and beliefs, and like we'll find points of correspondence, and we'll engage with those people and form deeper relationships with those people, or if we experience friction, we'll often splinter off and go our own way. And the Amish, some people will call the way they live like a cult, because there's like a high price to pay for leaving the community. Sometimes it can result in shunning, which is largely overplayed. It's not that the Amish are, yeah, basically, if you're not going to live according to the way of the Amish church, then the points of cohesion and connection evaporate, and it's hard for Amish people to maintain relationship with relatives that have left the way of life. And
mm,
so it's more of a passive form of shunning than like a very active form of shunning. But yeah, it's a high exit cost. But then when you look at the reality of the situation that we're living in this like industrial, capitalistic, colonial system or whatever, I mean, it's extremely hard to even leave this system. I
mm-hmm.
mean, you want to talk about a high exit cost. And so, I think like cults are kind of like the water that we swim in as fish, and we're not really aware of it, and we hesitate to call it what it is because, there's all kinds of negative baggage attached to that. But anyway, I'm meandering quite a bit here, but to answer your question, I would love to see the birth of a a more earth-centered. agrarian or subsistence oriented culture that has a cohesive set of beliefs and practices that translate into political and financial power and social cohesion. And I think moving into the world that we're moving into, it's just going to be so important to find those things because the power of group identity like that can't be understated.
Yeah. Yeah. I suspect something like a digital Amish movement is about to happen. There'll be some coordinated rejection of the unfiltered open internet and other digital technologies that communities will basically pick and choose about what aspects of the technology are beneficial and what are exploitative. But a quick related question. Do you think there is potential for the Amish community to run with agroforestry with these new systems and species as an alternative to like their established uh, methods?
Oh yeah, for sure. There's a local Amishman to me, Amos Fisher at White Oak Nursery, who he's got a bunch of grafted hickories and walnuts and persimmons, and I think he's even got some pawpaws and stuff like that. And he's old order Amish, and he's he's been an influence on other Amish, growing trees like that. There's also a lot of Amish involved in like the new silvopasture movements, which are incorporating a lot of tree crop agriculture into pastured context. So that would be a lot of mulberry, honey locust, persimmon, sometimes oaks and other species like that. Um, as far as like, yeah, I mean, Amos will sell cracked hickory nuts. Like you can buy bags of shelled shagbark and shellbark and hican nuts from him at his produce stand. But I haven't seen it as like a widespread adoption. This is sort of just like individual actors here and there,
Mm,
which is which is the same as in the non-Amish or the English community, as they would say. Um, and I think a lot of that, unfortunately, comes down to economics. The Amish are, they have to compete in the same world that everybody does, and so they have a financial bottom line, and they're also they've got the hyper Protestant work ethic. So, if a tree is not productive or if it doesn't yield good fruit or good nuts or an economic return, it doesn't have a lot of value in their culture. And that's one of the things that I would criticize. But, again, it's like look who's talking. It's the pot calling the kettle black. Because if you
mm,
look at the contemporary culture around us, there's, even less less reverence for you know the natural world beyond what you get at a grocery store or whatever. So yeah, all that to say, like these organizations like tree crops cooperatives and nut growers associations and farm to table dinners and brokering relationships with chefs and local producers and markets and things like that. This is all just like super important and it's part of the work because by getting these kinds of tree crops products out there into the marketplace and hopefully in some cases making them household names. Like everybody knows the song Chestnuts Roasting Over an Open Fire,
mm.
whether they've had a chestnut or not.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I mean, but by getting this stuff out there and building real marketing potentials around these tree crops, that's when people are going to start to adopt this stuff en masse. And
Mm,
so it's a difficult scenario because you don't want to. I mean, like one of the principles of permaculture thinking is that the problem is the solution, and if you say, oh, the problem is capitalism, and because of capitalism, there's no value on these things, and you turn that on its head and say, well, what if we use capitalism to then promote these things? And it's really tricky territory. I'm not trying to, you know, say that there's like that this is the answer, but it's at least part of the answer to getting things more more widely accepted. And fundamentally, it's a question of where your subsistence comes from.
Hmm.
Does your subsistence come from the roots that you pry out of the earth with your bare hands, or does it come from the cash that you earn at your wage job? And for most people, myself included, I just I've just found ways to translate that root into, that earthwork into financial, um, into money, into currency. But for most of us, most all of us, our subsistence depends on our earning power,
Hmm.
and we're it's not really going to turn around until we can cross the two wires, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah. No, I love that perspective. Now, where can people find more of your work? Give me a whole bunch of links and I'll put them in the show notes.
Yeah, sure. The only real social media I have these days, well, if you can even call it social media, I'm on Substack under my name, Zach Elfers, and I have intention to write much more than I'm able to find the time and the wherewithal to do, because I just get kept so busy and preoccupied with my nursery work and land work and other stuff. It's hard to find the time to write, much less read. So I'm hoping to change that, but you can find some of my writings there. And then before Substack, my blog was nomadseed.com, which you can still visit. I just my newer writings are on Substack, and at some
Hmm.
point maybe I'll migrate some of the older Nomad Seed writings onto Substack.
And you also run a
Um,
nursery, I believe. So if people are
yeah,
in the right region, they could potentially get plants from you.
and that's Future Forest Plants at futureforestplants.com. So I'm in southern York County, Pennsylvania, near the Maryland line. So if you're local, you can look me up through email or whatever and arrange a time to visit. But I do packing and shipping. So the orders can happen through the website and then ship to your door. Um, that's a that's a whole other story. But yeah,
Yes,
that's
yeah,
that's
I
that's what
had
I
it on
do.
my notes
Yeah.
to talk about your nursery, but I've talked to other people about similar tree nurseries in your part of the world. I'm like, no, there's other things we need to save the time for today.
Yeah.
We could have talked for
It's
another
also a
two
lot of
hours.
work.
Yes,
Yeah, I heard
yeah.
you interviewed Sean Dombrowski, so he's been
Hmm.
a good like influence on, my nursery development. But and then the Keystone Tree Crops Cooperative, we're at keystonetreecrops.com, or the new fancy URL is ktcc.coop.
Excellent.
And then yeah, if you want to get involved with the Northern Nut Growers Association or look up the conference that's coming up, July, I think it's July 31st through August 3rd. It's in Amherst, Massachusetts. You can go to nutgrowing.org.
Excellent. I'll make sure this episode comes out early enough that people can jump on that opportunity. With that, Zach, thank you for what has been an amazing conversation. I've kept you a really long time. I hope I haven't disrupted your day too much.
No problem at all. My pleasure.
Sign up for a free subscription to my Substack. Once a month, I post my favorite long form content links so you can get a little bit of human curated internet content. Next week, I talk to Dmitry Orlov for a uniquely Russian perspective on civilizational decline.